Okay, we now turn our attention to evolutionary psychology. Now, this is probably the most contentious area of psychology at the moment, purely by virtue of the fact that it looks at controversial questions. Whether they should be controversial or not really depends on your worldview. But essentially, what an evolutionary psychologist is looking at is not just what happens, what mental processes we have, but why do we have them? So if we think back to William James at the beginning of this series of lectures, James was looking at not just the structure of consciousness, but the experience and the function of consciousness. So evolutionary psychologists, by virtue of the fact that they're studying human behavior from an evolutionary perspective, are inherently functionalists. Now, there's a distinction between different levels of explanation for human behavior. At the kind of lower level, we have approximate explanation for why we behave or why we experience different things. The vast majority of science, not just psychology, but science as a whole, takes place at the proximate level of explanation. So we might ask, how do we experience colour vision? Or how do we make decisions in a given context? Now, this is really important for understanding the structure of consciousness and the structure of the mind. But an ultimate explanation asks why we do these things. So why do we experience colour vision? What function does that serve? What adaptive mechanism does that infer that we have? So ultimate explanations are, why do we experience a process, or why do we have a particular mental capacity? Now, the evolution of mental processes and behavioural traits, whether they're personality traits or behaviours that we enact, from an evolutionary perspective, are said to evolve by natural and sexual selection pressures. Now, what this means is that from a natural selection perspective, the traits that we have clearly have some adaptive value to them. They help us to survive. They serve a function, whether that's in relation to our own personal survival or to the survival of our group. From a sexual selection perspective, the behaviours that we enact typically are signals of our mating value to members of the opposite sex, and that helps us to prolong and kind of continue our line in the evolutionary timeline. Now, evolutionary psychology is typically invoked and typically understood as being something that explains personality traits and behaviours that we enact, and that's really people focusing on the sexual selection aspect of evolutionary psychology. But really, EP is something that can explain a range of different psychological phenomena. So not just personality traits and behaviour, but also the evolution of specific mental processes. So things like emotion, decision making, why we interpret visual stimuli in the way that we do. These can all be explained through evolutionary perspectives. So some typical questions that might be asked is, why do we experience a particular emotion? What is the function of shame, or of jealousy, or of happiness, or of anger, or of resentment? What is the function of these kinds of experiences, and what adaptive function do they serve in relation to our survival? Why do men and women differ in their interests and behaviours? This is probably one of the most contentious questions in the whole of psychological science at the moment. Are there differences between men and women that have evolved, and what function do they serve, and why do we have those differences? And how do our evolved tendencies affect our decision making? So, for example, are there certain environments, are there certain heuristics, are there certain processes that take place when we're making a decision that are driven by our adaptive evolved mechanisms? Now, these two researchers are John Tooby and Leda Cosmides. These are essentially the founders of evolutionary psychology. In the next video, I'm just going to quickly show you them talking about the natural selection of personality traits, and particularly traits related to different emotions. So you can really get a flavour of how evolutionary psychology can help us to understand these basic psychological mechanisms.
We have, from evolution, just a basic hedonic system that says, for the individual, what's good, what's pleasurable, what's advantageous, right? But as soon as you start to live with others and depend upon them, then you need a second signal that takes into account how your action might increase the way they value you, or how it might decrease the way they value you.
I am glad to share this time with the pioneers of the evolutionary psychology studies, Lida Cosmides and John Tooby. John, can you tell us about how evolutionary psychology may help us to understand our emotions like envy, guilt, shame, or pride? In which way evolutionary psychology brings us information regarding these emotions?
So the basic question one always asks is, you start with the recognition that, initially all life on Earth was single-celled, and that everything that we are now that's part of our species design had to be added sort of step by step. And so you ask the question, why is it there? What function does it serve for the organism? Otherwise it wouldn't be there, right? So in some ways this is a little bit monstrous to sort of say, what would people be like without, say, shame, okay? But you have to, that one appreciates the question as, what would a human be like without shame? Or, for example, and what would be a person with shame? And there you get a sense of what it might be doing. That's what's helpful for our ancestors in survival and reproduction. For our ancestors, they lived in small groups of people that were highly dependent on each other. So if you got sick, somebody had to bring you food. If you, somebody had to help you with your children, and if there was, a predator or something, somebody saved you, it would be very important. So it was, your life was highly dependent upon the being valued by other people. And therefore, if your psychology is just to take what's of advantage to you, do what's advantageous to you, then that could hurt other people, right? Because what might be in my interest might not be in another person's interest, right? Well, I would have the money, and money is good, right? But on the other hand, the people around me might value me less, right? And so then I have to say, in almost all behavior, there's a sort of implicit planning process that sort of says, what shouldn't I do because it will cause other people to value me less? And so that's experienced negatively, as it ought to be. I ought to be deterred from doing that. So I would feel shame. I think about doing this, and then, oh no, that would be shameful. And so even when you're not, haven't done something shameful, you're just making your decisions in life. Behind that, there's shame, or the opposite is pride, right? How can I become more valuable people? So I might do things that might be costly. I might sort of run a bigger risk in battle, or I might do other things. I may take food I might want to eat and give it to somebody else. And that I feel pride, right? And that's a positive pleasure that subtracts against the loss of and so these emotions, you add them into what the organism would otherwise be doing, and you see how it navigates us through the world in a way that makes you better off.
The evolutionary psychology is supported in very strong research. And one of your research is regards about economy and behavioral economics.
Yes.
Can you share with us, Lida, about your findings?
Adam Smith asked, he wondered whether the propensity to, how did he say it, to truck, barter, and exchange, whether that was part of human nature, or whether that was just arose from a sort of general kind of reasoning and the ability to speak. And the answer is human nature. We've done a lot of research over the years on different kinds of cooperation, but on social exchange, reciprocating favors, how you think about agreements to exchange. And it turns out that there's a set of mechanisms. You can think of it as a reasoning instinct. People think about instinct as the opposite of reasoning, but we have certain inference mechanisms that are complexly specialized for solving an adaptive problem. They reliably develop in all human beings, without conscious effort, without formal instruction. They're distinct from more general abilities to process information or think about other things. And our mechanisms for thinking about exchange are like that. In particular, evolutionary game theory shows that you can't get the evolution of cooperation of this kind unless you're able to detect cheaters. That is, people who take benefits from you without reciprocating, without paying the cost or meeting the requirement that you had for that favor. And so that made us look for, ask the question, do we have mechanisms in our heads that are specialized for looking for cheaters? And the answer is yes. You can take a reasoning problem you can take the same reasoning problem and have it be about social exchange, where looking for the violation of a rule would reveal a cheater, versus a rule about some other domain of life, like if a bird is a swan, then it's white. People are not good at looking for violations of that rule. They're not good at looking for black swans. Right? But if you make the rule be something like, well, if you borrow my car, then you should fill the tank with the gas. People are really good at realizing that the people that they have to check are the person that borrowed the car and the person who did not fill the tank with gas. And, on a rule like the swan kind of rule, maybe only 26% of the people will get that right, whereas 75% of the people will get it right when it's looking for cheaters. So that's thing one. We seem to have mechanisms that really are designed for understanding, exchange, and looking for cheaters. But that's not, that hunter-gatherers had to share in many different ways, not just through reciprocation. So in studies of Ache foragers in Paraguay, about 50% of the time, people come back with nothing when they go hunting. So what hunter-gatherers do is, when there's frequent reversals of fortune that are just due to luck, not effort, they share very widely. They pool the risk. It's an insurance. It's a form of social insurance. So since I can't store meat in a refrigerator for my family to eat later, I store it as a social obligation. So hunter-gatherers will, for things like meat, they'll share it very widely with people. And that's more like when Marx talks about from each according to his ability to each according to his need. He thought that's how hunter-gatherers share in general. No. Hunter-gatherers do share like that, but it's for meat, honey, things that are where luck plays a big role. For things where effort plays a big role, like when you're gathering foods, when you're gathering plant foods and things like that, it's not shared in the same way. People tend to have particular reciprocation partners, or they do explicit exchange. So it's not true that hunter-gatherers share everything as Marx thought. But we do have programs in our heads that switch what we think is fair when outcomes are due to luck versus effort. This is true not just for hunter-gatherers. You don't have to be raised as a hunter-gatherer for this to be true. You can take people, undergraduates from Japan or the United States, and if you give them money as a windfall, so just luck, and say you can divide that or not with somebody else as you wish, they do share that. But if they have to do something, especially something boring, in order to earn the money, then they don't share it. So it's as if our brain has different programs that are activated by different circumstances. The luck activates this, oh, I should share widely. The effort is, I should do this through reciprocation. And then we have still other programs that are for collective action, for cooperating to achieve a common goal and then share the resulting benefits. But that evolved for a very small social world. Hunter-gatherers tend to live in bands of 50 to 200 men, women, and children all together. So in that social world, if you're doing something as a group, you're hunting, collectively hunting or something like that, you know all the people, and you know if they're free riding or not. You know if they're supposed to be coming and helping you and they're back at the camp taking a nap. And so you're able to monitor who's contributing and who's not contributing. When you try to scale that up, as the Soviet Union did, for example, it collapses because you're scaling it up to large numbers of people on a collectivized farm. And what happens is without punishment, this has been shown in many economic games in laboratories too, without punishment, people, when they see free riding, they withdraw their own contributions until it dwindles to nothing. But the notion that Adam Smith was, what Adam Smith was saying is that through this system of people exchanging, that they can be doing it for their private gain, but it makes everybody better off. That's not intuitive. That's not intuitive to the human mind. To engage in exchange is intuitive, and to share widely when there's a difference due to luck, those things are intuitive. But the idea that this this micro level process of exchange can actually improve life for everybody, the problem is that that's not intuitive. All psychologists were trying to understand what are the information processing programs in the mind, what kind of software do we have, what kind of programs are in our heads. But we approach it with the recognition that these programs evolved to solve problems of survival and reproduction that were faced by our ancestors, our hunter-gatherer ancestors during evolutionary history.
Now that video covered the natural selection of human traits, but we also need to consider the sexual selection of human traits. Now, sexual selection refers to the process by which humans will try to reproduce with one another. One key idea in the area of sexual selection is signaling, and signaling theory is something that's been really kind of high profile recently with the kind of popularization of the term virtue signaling, and this is just one form of sexual selection. So according to evolutionary psychologists, we signal our suitability as a potential mate by exaggerating the traits that people of the opposite sex tend to find most attractive. So for men, on average, they might try to exaggerate or even kind of enhance their wealth or their social status, because this typically is a sign that they're able to care for offspring. For women, they will tend to exaggerate or enhance their beauty or their kind of outward appearance of youth and fertility. And these are things that typically men and women find attractive in the opposite sex. Now, obviously, there will be exceptions to these rules, but these are universal norms that are typically seen as being attractive in men and women across different cultures. Now, alongside that, what we also see is intrasexual competition, and this is where men might seek to derogate the perceived status of a competitor on the dating market, and women will do the same. So we might see instances of gossip that try to negate or bring down the status of people who you may see as being competitors for particular mates on that kind of sexual market. Now, David Buss is one person who has really revolutionized and pioneered, to be honest, the area of sexual selection, and Jeffrey Miller is somebody who pioneers work in the evolution of signaling theory. So they're two kind of key high-profile names that you might want to look out for when reading about these kinds of topics. Now, the process of doing evolutionary psychology from a research perspective is really interesting. It's probably one of the most interesting areas of psychology to study. So Gad Saad is one person who really kind of talks about the process of doing evolutionary psychology as an academic and as a researcher. His paper in the Journal of Marketing Research is probably the best example of how a researcher has been able to step by step talk through the process of doing evolutionary psychology. And he talks about building a nomological network of cumulative evidence. Now, what this means is that you bring strands of data and strands of evidence together from different subdisciplines, not just of psychology, but of biology and anthropology and marketing and any other area of social science, that all converge on the same conclusion. So you might have different strands of evidence using different methods and from different disciplines that all fall on one conclusion. If this is the case, then you have a nomological network of cumulative evidence that points towards a universal that seems to indicate an evolutionary explanation for why we do a particular thing, or why we have an evolved trait, or why we have an evolved emotion, or why we see differences between men and women or boys and girls. These nomological networks provide comprehensive evidence of a common underlying explanation, an ultimate explanation. Now, there are some criticisms of evolutionary psychology. Some people suggest that they are just so stories. So it might be that somebody observes a difference between two groups and they will come up with some kind of fanciful evolutionary explanation as to why that difference occurs. Now, just thinking back to what I've just said about nomological networks of cumulative evidence, this isn't the way that evolutionary psychologists typically work. And actually, evolutionary psychology tends to have a higher replication rate than other areas of psychology, precisely because they rely on these big nomological networks of cumulative evidence. It may be that some men prefer less fertile women or less kind of nubile women than others. These will be exceptions to the rule rather than the rule themselves, but that doesn't negate the fact that there is a universal rule that is typical of human natural or sexual selection. Some people see evolutionary psychology as being deterministic because it tends to be driven by biologically rooted explanations. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's deterministic, but that is one criticism that some people level at evolutionary psychology. And you also have the idea that some people will refer to evolutionary psychology as being sexist or racist or transphobic or homophobic because it looks at evolved processes and differences between groups and populations. Now, it's really important to address this criticism, I think, and I came across one meme online that I think really encapsulates the distinction between what people tend to think evolutionary psychology does in terms of justifying behaviors and what evolutionary psychology actually does in terms of describing a particular behavior. Now, this distinction between justification and description is vital to understanding what evolutionary psychology is and the function that it serves in terms of describing human experience. And to conclude, evolutionary psychology is interested in description rather than justification.